Hi, today I want to talk about why it's important that you should read books that really challenge you as a church leader, whether you're a pastor or whether you're a layperson. I did a video on the similar topic at one point before, but I want to put a little more flesh on it. I want to start by sharing about two different experiences that I had, because I think it will give some context of where I'm coming from. At one time, I had a friend who was part of a group of people who would gather together and have discussions on a weekly basis. You could call it a Bible study, but you might also call it a book study, because while the Bible was often in the background of these conversations, it was almost never the primary text. Usually it was some other book that was being used that focused on some aspect of what it meant to be a Christian that formed the basis of the discussions. Well, after a while of this group meeting, this friend lamented to me that they didn't think like their group was growing in their faith the way they felt that they should. And they asked me if I had any recommendations for the kinds of book that they might use to do a better job. Well, I had a recommendation in mind almost immediately. I suggested that they try Disciple Bible Study. I've done a video about that before because I feel like it's a very good study. And I also stressed the fact that their Fast Track edition it has a leader guide that actually makes it very easy for anybody who's interested to be able to lead it, even if they don't have any training. Now, this friend had heard me talk about Disciple before, and so they told me that they were not sure that Disciple would be the right fit for them at that time because, as they said to me, and quite truly, Disciple does require a fair amount of time and effort from the various participants. Now, to be very clear, I'm well aware of the fact that Disciple Bible Study is not going to be the right choice of resource for every group that you might be a part of. If the primary purpose of your group is not Bible study, it would not be a good choice for you. Now, that being said, Bible study was this group's goal. They wanted a resource who would help them to know their Bibles better and to help their lives be transformed by the Word of God. Maybe it's true that Disciple seemed like it was an awful lot of work, but I could basically guarantee them it would do what they wanted it to do if they took the time and effort to do it right. Now, for the other conversation, you need a bit more context. For several years, I was part of a group in my church district where clergy and lay people would gather together once a month, and we would begin to do all kinds of thinking and planning about events and ways to deal with various issues in the church. And part of our time together involved discussing a book that we had read over the course of the previous month. Now, there have been a few of those books that have been really good and have been worthy of being reread and not just read the one time. But I began to notice a general trend. And for the last several months, we would get to the end of a book and we would discuss it together. And after we read all this and had this discussion, we would end with one question, which was, how are you going to take what you have read and learned in this book and apply it into your daily ministry? And we inevitably got to that point, and the answer around the room was either silence or I'm not going to. I'll describe one of the books so you get a clue of what I'm talking about. We had one book where we read it, and the main point of the book was to be on the lookout for where God might place you, because God is at work everywhere, and no matter where you find yourself, you have work to do for God. And it's a good point, and it's one that was on my mind because I'm a United Methodist pastor, and I had just been moved to somewhere I had not anticipated being. The problem with the book is that I could summarize the main point of it in just a sentence. It was, no matter where you are, whether you're happy to be there or not, there are always opportunities to serve and love God and your neighbor, so look for them if you can't see them. Now, again, I want to stress that's not a bad idea. That's not a bad point. But the author made that basic point at least 3 times just in the introduction to the book. And then subsequent chapters were essentially just rehashing that same point told over and over again with slightly different examples, but no real further insight. Now, my particular copy of this book was a digital edition, and so as I'm flipping through and reading it, I'm not necessarily feeling how far I am through the book like you are with a physical book. And so after chapter upon chapter of this, I started thinking to myself, I have got to be almost finished with this book that doesn't say anything new in spite of all the chapters. And when I checked, I realized I was only just barely halfway through with it. The problem, as it seems to me, is that it feels as though the origin of this book was as a blog that was being written by somebody who had an unexpected move into an unexpected situation, and so they wanted to write about it and chronicle the ups and downs of their life in this new ministry opportunity. And the thing is, that can work really, really well as a way to keep friends and family updated and to give you an excuse and a reason to be thinking about and analyzing your experience in ministry. But when you publish it as a book, it makes it come off as a really long book that does not have very much of substance to say. And we had several books like this in a row. They were fairly long. They had one basic insight that they repeated over and over and over again, and then really had nothing else to contribute to our conversation. And so after several months of this, I pointed out this trend to the rest of the group, and I said, if we're going to read something, maybe we should read something that's going to be really worth reading, because that way, even if we can't make a direct line between the book that we've read and how it's affecting our daily ministry, at least it will be stretching us as a person. It will be forcing us to think in new ways, and that may help us enrich ourselves as people, which will help our ministry down the line. And they said, that sounds like a good idea, and they asked, do you have any ideas for a book that we could do together that fits that bill? Now, the book that I recommended was a book by a man named Thomas S. Kuhn, and it's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And it has nothing at all to do with church ministry on the surface, but it is a book that has done more to help me interact with people, understand people, and make careful decisions than pretty much anything else I'd ever read. And I drew attention to the fact that it's a book that has been read by all kinds of people in all kinds of different fields, and so I said it's a pretty user-friendly experience to get at some of these ideas, and they agreed. Now, when we got together, we had some good discussion. I did realize over the month that we were reading it together that it was a little bit less user-friendly than I had remembered it being, but it made for a very good conversation. I apologize for throwing people into a little bit deeper water than they might be expecting, but it was clear that it really was stretching us and our ways of thinking about the world. Now, the problem with the book is that aside from myself, who had reread it several times, nobody else was able to complete the book in the period of time. And the most common response that was given is that it was really difficult to read it at any speed because it was so much more challenging than the other books that we had read together. And so we ended up with basically the same dilemma that other friend of mine had. We seemed to be faced with a choice. We could either read book after book after book that is easy to read, easy to discuss, easy to get through, but then essentially useless for any application in our lives, or to read books that are going to help us in our lives, but are so challenging that we may not actually get around to reading them or get through them when we try. This is what I take away from those kinds of experiences. It seems like what we really want is a foolproof way to know before we even begin that what we do and what we read and what we engage with is going to be worth our time. It's going to be stretching us. It's going to help us know what's going on. And we're going to know ahead of time that it's going to be worthwhile. And we really even know ahead of time what we're going to get out of it. But the thing is, we also want it to be easy enough that we can engage with it without too much extra effort. The problem is, it doesn't seem to be like those two things can coexist. If a book is going to be challenging enough and worthwhile enough to really help us to grow, it means it's also going to be challenging enough so that it really can feel like work when we read it. On the other hand, if a book is going to be easy enough for us to read without expending too much time and energy, it's almost certainly going to leave us with not that much substance at the end of it. The irony is, I have heard people advocate for learning in ministry as if the main goal is just keep reading those lightweight books, just one right after the other, and somehow eventually it will make us into better preachers and leaders and theologians and all the rest. But the problem is that way of approach can really only ever be moderately helpful at best. And I think that part of the problem is with us as church leaders, whether we're clergy or lay. We sometimes will, as clergy, whether we always intend to or not, will sometimes criticize our lay people for not having the theological education that we've had. And we sometimes assume that they can't be asked to read something challenging because they haven't had the same background that we have had. Well, maybe that lack of theological training is a concern, but I'm starting to think that maybe it might also be our own fault. I mean, it's true that I haven't always gotten lots of takers to do difficult reading discussions together over a long period of time, but I also wonder if it's because people don't see any good examples of what that might look like. I mean, after all, if those of us who do have an advanced theological training don't engage in books and experiences that stretch us and enrich us, how can we be surprised if the people that we're leading among also don't want to do it? In any case, I would encourage you to avoid getting into any kind of rut where you don't read anything that's too challenging because it just feels like it's too hard. And I would encourage you, if you find yourself already in a rut like that, to get out of it as fast as you can. We wouldn't expect a doctor to stop learning things just because they got good training in medical school. We want them to keep learning. We want them to keep growing. We want them to keep getting better at what it is that they do. And I think the church is expecting that of us as leaders in the church. So let us not disappoint them. Well, that's all for this week. If you have any questions or any topics you'd like me to take up, send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.